Dora.
Hi, Dora. Yes.
Welcome, Dora. We're really happy that you want to join us because you're the expert on the smell of mummification in ancient Egypt. But first of all, what brought you to study smells as an Egyptologist?
I took a course about the archaeology of the senses while I was still doing my master's degree. And I was looking for a sense that hasn't been well researched in Egyptology. So I saw that there's a lot written about hearing and seeing in ancient Egypt, but not a lot about smell. So I was curious about it and I wrote a paper about it and I saw there is a lot more to that. So it became a master's thesis. And then I realized that a master's thesis is not enough because it's just a huge topic. There's so much to say, and it became a PhD topic. So that's how a friend of mine said that she thinks that I've always been really in tune with my sense of smell. So she thinks I chose it subconsciously. And well, maybe it's a little bit of both.
So Dora, by the way, how nice that you're wearing orange, since we're talking about William of Orange and his embalming. And earlier I sent you the recipe and I was so curious. I was wondering, are the ingredients more or less the same as in ancient Egypt?
All right, let me look at the ingredients again.
So we have lavender, we have thyme, there's myrrh, aloe, cedar wood, rosemary, iris.
Right. Iris, yes. Okay, so myrrh. Myrrh was a very important ingredient in ancient Egypt. We have evidence of myrrh on mummies from the pre-dynastic period. So myrrh is one of those ingredients that the Egyptians started using the very beginning of their history. Even though myrrh does not come from Egypt, it comes from the area of Somalia, from the land that they called Punt. So they imported myrrh from faraway countries from very early on. It was extremely important for mummification. Now let's look at mint. That would be the next ingredient. There was no mint in the mummification process, but mint was used for the mummy garlands that were placed on the bodies. Mummies were completely covered in garlands from head to toe, and they were associated with life-giving scents. So that was very important. Those garlands were on the mummies, not only because they have a very beautiful, vibrant color, but also because the Egyptians believed that these scents were associated with nature coming back to life. And if you have those scents on your body, then it magically helps you coming back to life. And mint was one of those ingredients. Lavender, no, the Egyptians did not have any lavender. Thyme, no thyme in ancient Egypt. No nutmeg, no iris. They had calamus, or also called sweet flag, and they imported it from the area of the Levant. So today's Israel, Syria, Lebanon, that area, they used the root of the sweet flag. For example, kifi has a lot of sweet flag in it. That's an ancient Egyptian perfume, kifi in Greek, or kaped. That's one of the earliest perfume recipes from the world and the only documented perfume recipe from ancient Egypt. Styrax, well, styrax is recorded in the kifi recipe. However, no styrax was discovered on Egyptian mummies yet. There was a chemical analysis done by Margaret Serpico that showed there was probably some styrax in one of the 7 sacred oils, which was probably used for embalming. It's not quite clear yet. So for now, I would say we're not exactly sure. And let's look at aloe. I think that was the last ingredient. No aloe in ancient Egypt. Was there anything else?
No aloe?
No.
No.
Was there anything else?
Yeah, majoram. Or let's see.
Nope.
No.
And is this all? How do you know about all these botanical things from ancient Egypt?
Well,
you know?
a lot of my research is the plants and all the resins that the ancient Egyptians used. And answering your question, actually, the botanical identifications is a very big issue in Egyptology. It's a very problematic matter. Sometimes one of the most well-known words for certain fragrant substances are not clearly identified. We're still not sure. For example, there's a big discussion about untiu, whether that is myrrh or not myrrh. I do believe it's myrrh. There's quite a lot of evidence for it now. I'm writing an article about it where I do prove that it's myrrh, but there's one of like a lot of those words where you know the word, you've seen it 1,000 times and you're still not exactly sure. It's quite a big problem in Egyptology, the botanical identifications. It's getting better all the time. There's new evidence all the time. So it is possible, for example, that you're translating a text and you're identifying a certain plant with a certain botanical identification in English. And a few years later, there's some new study that comes out and then you have to revise your entire translation. It's very possible. So I always say with the scent that I reconstruct personally, I do a lot of experimental archaeology. I always say that based on a current stand of research, this is the best we could do. But keep in mind that this could get better in the future as research gets better. I never say that if I reconstruct a scent, I never say that this is exactly the way it was in ancient Egypt, because you can never be sure. It wouldn't be scientific. And also, you just have to keep in mind that things could have also smelled slightly differently in antiquity. Plants change, the environment changes, so it also changes the smell of the plants or the bark or the resin. That's also something we need to remember.
Yeah. And can you trace plant material back to a plant, or is it not possible? Like if they find in tombs or graves balms or perfume like things, can they by chemical?
There is a lot of chemical analysis being done. A lot of the volatile components disappear. Just to give you an example. Mm-hmm. A lot of mummies have conifer resins. Then it's hard to say if it was pine or cedar. They're both conifer because those chemical compounds that would be able to tell you the difference between pine and cedar disappeared. So you can only say it's conifer. Whether pine resin or cedar resin, we don't know. So it does have its limits, obviously, because we're dealing with substances that are thousands of years old.
Okay, thank you. Caro, can you, do you have still questions about the ingredients, or shall we go to the way of embalming?
So that's really interesting that many of the ingredients are similar and some are not. But now let's take a look at the process. The court physician also described the different steps, not very detailed, but at least to some detail. The first step was to make an incision. The second step was to wash the inside of the body with all the materials that we discussed. Then it was sewn back together, and then the nose and ears were clogged or were closed with myrrh and wax. And the final stage would be to use a wrap, and in Dutch that's called a sparadrap, a cloth soaked in turpentine and wax. Is it similar to the ancient Egyptian technique?
It's very similar. I was really surprised. So the first step of mummification was removing all the internal organs. They made a cut always on the left side, and they took out the internal organs, not the heart, because the heart was the center of thought, the center of emotion, so they always left that intact. They took out the organs, mummified them, put liquid resin on them, and also bandages, and they put them into big jars. Then they cleaned the abdominal cavity and put all sorts of fragrant substances in there. For example, crushed myrrh, sawdust of conifers, lichen. Lichen is really fluffy and fragrant, so it really fills up that cavity. All sorts of berries, resins, everything that really fills up belly and smells good. And then they close that cavity. After that, you have the drying stage. And I think that's missing in the embalming of Wilhelm the Orange. That's definitely missing there. So Herodotus tells us that the body was dried for 70 days with natron salt. And there's two theories. Either there was a natron bath where the mummy was placed in a bath full of natron in a liquid form, or they used dried natron. That's the other method. And then they also probably placed little packets containing natron on all sorts of different parts of the body that contained a lot of water. For example, the upper thighs or the sexual organs, they contain a lot of water, so they may need a little more salt. I was a little surprised that with Wilhelm of Orange, there was no drying stage, because the body contains a lot of water and it really what causes you to start rotting. So it's essential, if you want to mummify somebody, that you take out all that water. And because the Egyptians did so, the third stage was the waterproofing stage, giving the moisture back to the body, because after the natron salt stage, they ended up having a very dried up, sad looking mummy. And what they wanted is someone that looks like themselves. They wanted to preserve the body essentially for afterlife. So they gave back that moisture to the body that was missing now. And they used liquid resin for that. So they just melted resin. They used 3 types, a lot of myrrh, cedar, and pine. And they just melted that and poured it in liquid form on the body. And that does quite a few things. So first of all, like I said, it gives back that moisture to the body that was missing. This is why it's also called the waterproofing stage. It also seals the body from all sorts of worms, insects, anything that would harm the corpse. And that it also smells good. So that stench of the putrefying corpse disappears, and you start smelling quite nice. And also it preserves everything, right? So resin, that's what it also does in nature. It seals the wound of the tree and it preserves it from further damage. So the resins had quite a few functions at the same time. And at this point, also juniper berries, celery seeds were just placed on the body, all over on the body, everywhere. Then you can also find garlic in the armpits or between the toes, or just sometimes all over the body. Sometimes also slices of onion. And the very last stage would have been to close those cavities or cuts that were open. So I was talking about that cut and the stomach that was made. So that was closed with beeswax, and also there was a cut or a hole made through the nose. They had a hook. They put it up through the nose to take out the brain. The brain came out, and they closed that. So they closed all the cavities of the body. That cut here that I was talking about, they closed the ears, the nose, and the lips with the beeswax. And that was the third stage. And the fourth stage would have been the wrapping stage, where they used mummification bandages. Usually they were used linen bandages only for royals. They had completely new linen, and they cut them up, just put it on the body. They also used some gum arabicum or gummi arabicum. They use that in liquid form as well. So these mummification bandages were really soaked in gummi arabicum, and that was placed on the body and used as a gum so that the bandages wouldn't move. And the very last stage would have been, again, to melt resin, probably pistachio resin or boswellia, frankincense, the Egyptians called senecher. It means to make divine. So this substance was not a very specific botanical identity. It was a function. It made the mummy divine and everything that it came in contact with. And they took that liquid resin, poured it on the body, and sometimes they poured so much that the mummy is completely stuck to the bottom of the coffin. It's really hard to take it out. In certain cases, you also see it outside on the coffin and the bottom. So I saw a coffin not so long ago, the British Museum in London, that had so much liquid resin at the very bottom. It was a very thick layer. So that was a fourth stage. It's very similar to what you described to me, Caro.
Okay, that's really intriguing. By the way, Peter Forestus, he didn't describe the process very detailed, as I said before, but it's very well possible that there was a drying stage as well. What is very remarkable is that he had to be embalmed the very same day, the day of his death, when he was murdered in 1584. And his physician also said that this embalming was supposed to make the body last for 8 to 10 years. Now, how long would an Egyptian mummy last after such a process as you described?
Oh, 8 to 10 years is not good. It's you want to have your mummy preserved for eternity. 8 to 10 years is no good. Sorry, that's not going to cut it. Basically, you want to live an eternal life, so you need your body. And the Egyptians did a really good job, as you could tell, because some mummies are still preserved, and you look at a person and they're almost alive in their death. You see the person, you see their hair, you see their eyelashes, their mouth, you see the way they were. You see an actual person. In case a mummy is well preserved, it also depends on the way it was mummified. There were a lot of different techniques of mummification based on what you could afford. So it was also a matter of hierarchy. And that way we could say there was an olfactory hierarchy also in death, because the type of mummification that you could get really depended on your status, your social standing. So when I was mentioning everything like is preserved, and I'm talking about mummies that were completely mummified with the best technique that was available in ancient Egypt. Usually these mummies come from the New Kingdom. So mummification reached a peak in the New Kingdom, and after that it kind of went downhill.
And how do you think these techniques survived? How can it be that still in the Netherlands they knew how to do it?
I think it must be a combination between text and practice. And of course things change and translations go wrong. That's what I also learned from Dora. One of my favorite scents that was in fact used for the embalming of Christ. It's Easter now, so it makes a bit of sense to talk about it. Jesus' feet were embalmed with spikenard, and I always thought that spikenard was part of kifi. And then Dora found out that it must be a mistranslation by the Greeks. Can you say something about that, Dora?
Right. Well, it's possible that there was spikenard in one of the Greek kifi recipes. I was looking into the original Egyptian kifi recipes, and I did not use the Greek recipes because the Greek recipes are always a Greek perception of an ancient Egyptian recipe. It's not the original one. There was no spikenard in Pharaonic Egypt. The Egyptians did not have it. Spikenard is not native to any area that the Egyptians had contact with in their dynastic history. So spikenard grows in South China, I think, India, right? Yes, so Egyptians did not have trade contact with these areas, at least not in their dynastic history. So there is this description of Alexander the Great going to India, and his soldiers are in chariots and they crush a plant that smells really good, and all of a sudden it smells so strong. And that was spikenard. That is how they discovered it. And it's very possible that in a Hellenistic period, Egypt had spikenard.
Yeah.
So after that, after Alexander the Great took over Egypt and all the other areas and created a Hellenistic empire, it is very likely that spikenard made its way to ancient Egypt, but not before that. So you might be able to see it in a Greek recipe, but keep in mind, the Greeks could have used the ingredients available in their time in a so-called Egyptian recipe, right? So there is a recipe, and then it develops with time, and then at your time, you use whatever ingredients are available.
Yeah, I think also aloe wasn't available for the ancient Egyptians, and it was available for the court physician of Willem van Oranje. I have a final question for Dora. In your professional life, you sniff, you go out and sniff things. What is the best thing you smelled so far?
Okay, this is going to sound a little odd now, but the best thing I smelled in my professional career is a mummified stomach. I went to a museum in Hanover in Germany. I did some museum research there, and I had the opportunity to smell a mummified stomach in a jar that is protected by the god Duamutef. He is the patron god, the protector god of the stomach, and it smelled really good. It smells amazing. Actually, it smelled appetite-inducing.
And what did it smell like? Can you explain a bit more? Appetite-inducing, like?
I was hungry after smelling a mummified stomach. It smelled really good. I wanted to eat.
To eat the stomach, or even, or not?
I did not have any of the mummified stomach. No.
You didn't even lick it. No.
No, but it was really good. It smells really good. Just very pleasant. And the worst thing that I smelled in my life was a mummified cat in Japan. That was just horrendous. That was really, really bad.
Did you smell the rotting corpse, or?
I think that's what a rotten corpse smell. I never smelled a rotten corpse, but I think that's the smell.
Okay. Well, I must say the reconstruction I did of the embalming of William of Orange smelled pretty good. And it was a bit like Eau de Cologne 4711 because it was so fresh, but of course it had a lot of darker base notes. But I also understand why you describe it as yummy, gourmand, because many of the ingredients are edible, right? You could actually eat it.
Yeah. Definitely. All the ingredients that the Egyptians use, almost all of them are edible.
Also the resins.
Yeah. Well, you have to be careful. For example, camphor is very dangerous. If you take more than 4 grams, you could die. It's lethal. But most of them are absolutely edible.
And how did they get such vast amounts of resin?
The Egyptians did not have any resins themselves, so they got them from foreign lands. Every resin they have came from another country. So they went into great lengths to get all these ingredients.
Yeah.
They got tons of pistachio resin. They got a lot of cedar resin, pine resin, myrrh.
Incredible. And this all arrived with ships to Egypt.
Yes. Yes. There was one rack, the Uluburum shipwreck, that transported 1 ton of pistachio resin that was probably all going to Egypt.
Wow.
They used it on their mummies. They used it every single day in the temples for fragrant remedies. We know that from medical recipes. They used it for perfumes. They used it for pretty much everything, and they did not have any of those, so they needed to get them from foreign countries. They got them as tribute, as booty, the war booty. And also as just through trade.
Yeah. And then my final question, the garlic.
The garlic and the mummies.
Underneath the armpits.
Yeah, isn't that quite intriguing? I think it's quite interesting. The Egyptians loved garlic.
They loved the smell.
They just ate a lot of garlic.
Yeah.
So now that it's also Pesach, not only Easter. So for example, there is this one story in the Exodus where the Israelites are going out of Egypt and they're in the desert and they say, oh, we want to go back to Egypt. We miss the garlic.
Wow.
So the Egyptians were very well known for eating a lot of garlic. It's very healthy. And why are they putting it on their mummies? That's very interesting. I never try to really figure it out. I don't think there's an answer. But
it could be that maybe that the off-putting aspect that we think is present in garlic also wasn't considered off-putting at the time. You can imagine garlic being fresh and having a fresh smell.
Maybe they had a different perception of the smell of garlic, either that or they thought that garlic is a good ingredient to have to repel insects, disinfects maybe.
Yeah.
Dora, is it at all possible that the ancient Egyptians also wore garlic during their lifetime as a kind of deodorant or reodorant?
No, I don't know any evidence of that. There is a recipe for stench in the summer. That's exactly what it's called. Remedy for stench in the summer, if you're sweating. And that's made out of myrrh, this substance called sennacher that I mentioned, which is either frankincense or pistachio resin. And there's another plant that we can't identify. If I recall, there was also some juniper berries in there. And all of these are really good against sweating. Somebody asked for this recipe, by the way, a friend of mine. She said that her deodorants are not working anymore and I should give her some ancient Egyptian remedy. I sent the recipe to her. I don't know. I have to check with her if it works. It was last summer. She was sweating a lot, so she asked for an ancient Egyptian remedy. But I don't know of any garlic being used for that.
We're talking about the William of Orange embalming.
How similar it was to ancient Egyptian method.
Right. Just what year is it exactly that it died?
1584.
Well, it was before the profession of Egyptology, right? So I wonder how much they knew back in the day in the 16th century about mummification and all the ingredients. I don't think a lot. So a lot of knowledge was gone and was lost forever after the Arab conquest of ancient Egypt. Not only that, that's when mummification stopped, by the way, completely. But even before that, after the burning down of the Library of Alexandria, a lot of knowledge was lost. So I wonder if they really had any knowledge of ancient Egyptian embalming ingredients in the 16th century in Europe.
Could it have been passed down to ancient Greece first and from there throughout Europe?
That's possible. That was some knowledge being passed on and maybe they lost the origin of it at a certain point. Maybe they didn't even know where it's coming from. That is very possible.
This could be a nice future research.
Yeah.
Let us write an article about it at a certain point. Sounds really good.
Okay.
No. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your wonderful insights.
Sure.